In this video, we will draw out some of the highlights of the development of the regulations, the way airports are funded, so the regulations, the funding, and the airport structures over the years. The PowerPoint in your text will provide more in-depth level of information, so be sure to dig into that. But the intent of this video is to explain and draw out connections to some of the more important factors. In the early years of aviation, flying machines landed in fields, roadways, polo fields, etc. Federal, local, and personal resources were more focused on developing, improving, and marketing the flying machine than really developing landing zones for them. Landing zones were many options for landing zones, but the resources were really going into developing this thing that they called the flying machine. The first municipal airport, in fact, was Albany, New York. And the airport in Albany is actually kind of significant in itself because it generated the very first dispute as to who should fund the upkeep, improvements, and maintenance of the airport. Should it be federal funds or should it be local funds? You see, the then civil aviation authorities had closed the airport in 1938. They closed the airport, deeming it unsuitable for use. They had the authority to do that, but leading up to that closure, there was a dispute between the civil aviation authorities saying that the local municipality of Albany, New York needed to fund the required maintenance, and Albany said, well, no, in fact, the airport serves federal government needs as well. Federal government should be involved. So the dispute ensued. The civil aviation authorities closed the airport in 1938. In 1940, then, the civil aviation, which is almost 2 years later, the local government had in fact paid for the necessary improvements with no federal aid at all, and the civil aviation authorities authorized the airport to reopen. Today, both federal and local funds are used to support infrastructure of airports. It is the responsibility of the local municipality to keep their airport running, as they will benefit from their airport. However, it is also the responsibility of the federal government to keep airports running, as the airport contributes to the national security and national infrastructure of the entire nation. So really, it's a combination that happens today. Let's talk about how we got to this point. We'll start by going back quite a bit before the Albany, New York drama. After World War I, pilots and airplanes were used in support of the development of the U.S. airmail system. This contributed to the development of airports across the country, but those airports that were built and serviced were locally funded. In fact, in 1926, the Air Commerce Act was instituted to regulate civil aviation and to ensure development and stability of commercial aviation. However, note this, the act prohibited investment of federal funds in the development of airports. They were focused, they being the federal government, were focused on stabilizing the industry and figured that if a local area wanted an airport to connect them to the rest of the nation, they could build one on their own. Ironically, what changed all of that was the Great Depression that started in October 1929. In response to the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt initiated a massive government spending bill to jumpstart the economy and put Americans back to work again. All modes of transportation infrastructure, including airports, were included under the Works Progress Administration. That was the start of federal investment in airport development. Note that the federal government only supported half of the funds, while the airport sponsor had to supply the other half. That'll be of importance later on in our course. After that, though, World War II ensued, and World War II was considered a great growth era in aviation. And after World War II, the federal government recognized the need to invest in airports for national security and infrastructure purposes. The U.S. Army built hundreds of domestic airfields during World War II. And you can see the difference in spending levels between military airports and civilian airports during that time. So after the war, though, many of those airports were deemed surplus, and they were given to the local municipalities with the understanding that the airport would be used to service people without discrimination and that the airport would be available should the federal government need it for a national emergency. So at that time, after the war, Congress, recognizing the need for airport development and the benefit that it had on the national economy, it submitted a national airport plan recommending investment in airports, or recommending support of airports. And as a result of that national airport plan, the Federal Airport Act of 1946 provided, through a federal aid to airports program, provided grant money for airport projects. So grant money started coming in again for airport projects. The Federal Airport Act went through several different extensions and iterations over the next several years. So watch through your PowerPoint presentation as I take you through that journey, which will bring you to the Airport Airway and Development Act of 1970. The Airport Airway and Development Act of 1970 is the precursor to today's Title 14, Part 139 rule, which we're going to talk significantly about later on in our course. Part 139 is titled Certification of Airports. And today the Part 139 rule covers airports servicing scheduled airlines with 10 or more passenger seats and non-scheduled airlines with 30 or more passenger seats. We will get into Part 139 in depth, but for now understand the track taken from the beginning. No regulation of airports to the current airport regulation rules. The other really big deal in airport history and evolution happened as a result of deregulation. And by deregulation, we don't mean that airports are not regulated. What we mean is that airlines were no longer economically regulated. Remember that from 1939 through the late 1970s, the civil aviation authorities were responsible to economically regulate the airlines. This meant that the federal government set ticket prices that airlines could charge and routes that they could fly. The CAB it was. They said where an airline can fly and how much they can charge to get there. With deregulation came the freedom of capital enterprise in the aviation industry, or the airline industry. Airlines could raise and lower rates as they wanted, and they can compete for routes in markets that they chose. There were many groups with vested interest in aviation who feared deregulation. There was a lot of fear before deregulation took place. That's explained in your text and in the presentation. However, we want to make the jump here in the video between deregulation of the airlines and what possible impact this had, the deregulation had, on airports. Here we go. Deregulation changed the landscape of commercial aviation in many different and quite permanent ways. Specifically, though, of interest to airports. As a result of deregulation and competition, airlines found it efficient and more profitable to operate with a hub-and-spoke route structure. In this, airlines schedule banks of arrivals into a hub, passengers change planes, and then there are banks of departures. This provides significant challenge to an airport capacity, planning, and delay mitigation. We'll talk about that in future weeks, but for now, understand the reason for the hub-and-spoke route structure and the history of how we got to where we are now.